Hey guys, happy Monday. We are back. This is our third week of creative writing work. So we have already worked on creating a setting and putting characters in that setting and working on describing the setting and making the characters move and interact with it and all of that. We basically got one more thing that I want to talk about before we actually write the story, and that's dialogue, since most of us are going to have our characters talk to other characters, or even if that our character is just speaking in first person, then they're basically talking to the audience. So we want to talk about how we, as a class, want to talk about how to use dialogue and specifically today, I want to talk about how to use dialogue for something that we call exposition. So if you haven't done so already, please get yourself ready for notes, pause the video, and I'll see you on the next slide. So let's start off with some simple definitions of dialogue. I'm pretty sure you all know what dialogue is, but we'll define it anyway. There's a few things that I want you to understand about dialogue because it's not just talking. And second, exposition. What is this word? What does it mean? And how do we use it? So let's start first of all with dialogue. Dialogue is a conversation between two or more characters in a work of fiction. Obviously, we're talking about in a work of fiction. You can have dialogue in other forms. It doesn't have to be fiction. But right now, we're talking just about fiction. So it's a conversation between two or more characters. You could consider sometimes when a story is told in first person, as if the character is speaking to the audience, then maybe it's not really a conversation, but it's a it's a I guess it's an exposition of the story, and there's that word again. So so it's a conversation between two or more characters in a work of fiction. There's a few rules that we need to follow when we use dialogue. First of all, dialogue should always push a story forward. A lot of times what happens is we want our characters to talk and they get in these just kind of circles of just talking about things like they're recapping what happened, or maybe they're worrying about something that's going to happen next, or something like that, and they'll get kind of bogged down in it. You always want to make sure that if your characters are speaking to each other, that it's moving the story forward from where it was to where it needs to go, and it's not just spinning its wheels, which is another which leads us to the second main point, that is, character dialogue is not small talk. If you want to have dialogue in your story, but you don't know what your characters should say, you should never just have them start talking. A discussion about the weather or a discussion about just some random thing that, isn't important to the story is ultimately going to make your readers not care about the story. So you have to find ways of having your characters engage in dialogue that is going to be relevant to the story and not just a whole bunch of nothingness. Um, so that's where this idea of exposition comes in. So exposition is a great way to make sure that when your characters are speaking, and this isn't the only way that we would use dialogue, obviously, but it's one way to use dialogue. Excuse me, sorry. So the and that's for this thing that we call exposition, which is anytime that in our writing we're clarifying the background or the context or the conflicts of the writing or of the story. So exposition is when we're finding out those important pieces of historical information that are important to understanding the world that they live in. Or where the characters came from, or who the characters are related to, or what the characters were doing before the story started, or whatever, what the characters are worried about happening. All those kinds of things are going to push the story forward and keep us out of small talk. It's going to reveal certain things to the audience. It's going to clarify certain things to the audience. Um, what you have to be careful about with exposition is it can't be too obvious or readers aren't going to believe it. Because if you think about the way that we actually speak to each other, we don't very often sit down and have a conversation with somebody else that goes over our background or our context or our conflict. So these are, these aren't normal conversations that people would have. So you have to find ways in which you can have your characters talk about these things without just feeling like the characters just dumping a whole bunch of exposition on on you. And that can be tricky, which is why we're going to look at an example in just a second. So I have this um, over here. It's just, I don't know, I was filling in the bubbles. So you got the lady saying, do you think that dialogue could be used to help spice up the exposition of a story? And the guy thinks, as long as it doesn't turn into awkward, forced small talk like this conversation. Now, the question that the lady is asking is a legitimate question. Yes, dialogue could be used to spice up the exposition of the story. But the thought that the guy is having back to her about saying, oh, as long as it doesn't turn into this awkward, forced situation, is also important. That if you're using dialogue to spice up the exposition so that you don't just feel like you're just writing a whole bunch of exposition, but you're actually having the characters explain the world around them, you have to do that in a way that it doesn't feel weird or sound strange to the audience. And that's the real trick. So we're going to look at an example of exposition and dialogue from The Lord of the Flies, which I gave you a different example from The Lord of the Flies last week that was describing Ralph and how his actions on the island kind of help us understand the type of person that he is. This is a conversation between Ralph and another character. Excuse me, it's early in the morning and I'm doing this. This is a conversation between Ralph and another character named Piggy. We never actually find out Piggy's actual name. And it's toward the beginning of the book, just as Ralph, um, uh, just as we need to know more about this world. So the conversation starts with Piggy. Piggy asks, "Where's the man with the megaphone?" The fair boy shook his head. The fair boy is Ralph. "This is an island. At least I think it's an island. That's a reef out in the sea. Perhaps there aren't any grown-ups anywhere." The fat boy looked startled. "There was that pilot, but he wasn't in the passenger cabin. He was up front." The fair boy was peering at the reef through screwed-up eyes. "All them other kids," the fat boy went on. "Some of them must have got out, mustn't they? Aren't there any grown-ups at all?" "I don't think so." So this conversation between Ralph and Piggy is, it's a conversation. They're going back and forth. They're, discussing their situation. But in doing so, it's also clarifying for the readers a whole bunch of things. So here are the things that we learn in this conversation. First of all, we learn that they were on a plane, right? We learn this from um, when they're talking about the pilot and the passenger cabin and being up front. So they must have been on a plane. We also, it's clarified for us that now they're on an island. So we can kind of figure out at least how we got there. We also know that people died, including kids. There were adults on the plane, but apparently they're dead. And there's also um, uh, this possibility that there are, that other children were killed as well. So we're starting to wonder for ourselves now through this expository dialogue. Well, what happened? Did the plane crash? It must have crashed, right? So now we also it's revealed to us that there are no adults on the island, and it's revealed to us that there might be more kids out there, which sets us up now to kind of expect more kids to start showing up, but also kind of shocks us into thinking like, oh my gosh, these kids are stuck on this island a little bit more. So through this conversation, instead of the author who could have just written all of this in a paragraph, um, he could have just had Ralph think it to himself or whatever. Instead, he reveals all of this information through a conversation or through dialogue, which really kind of makes the story a bit more interesting. It also introduces us to the new character of Piggy, and it helps us understand the world around them. So, what I'd like you to consider for tomorrow, which will be a writing activity, is first of all, who might your character speak to? Um, I'm going to ask for your activity tomorrow, even if you don't want to have a second character in your story, that your character actually speaks for the activity to another character. So who might they actually speak to? And what would they talk about? And why or how would that be interesting to the reader? So having your character talk to another character about the things that are going on around them will really help you clarify the world a little bit more, but also figure out like, does the reader actually care about this, or how could they speak about this in a way that the reader would care? So that will be tomorrow's activity. I'll see you then.